She said it the way people say things they've been holding too long, not carelessly, but with the specific relief of something finally set down. My name is Nora Callahan, and I was 38 years old the night my sister's bachelorette party ended my marriage. We were at a wine bar in Burlington, 12 women around a table covered in pink ribbon and novelty straws, and Simone, my best friend of 9 years, Jess's maid of honor, the woman who had been in my kitchen more times than I could count, leaned across to refill my glass and said, too quietly for anyone else to hear but too loudly to take back, "I told Derek this would come out eventually." I told him. She said it looking at her own hands. Then she looked up and saw my face, and I watched her understand in real time what she had just done. I'm Nora Callahan. I teach English at Millhaven Regional. I've been married, or I believed I'd been married, for 11 years to a man named Derek Callahan, an architect with a regional firm, broad-shouldered and careful with language, the kind of man who remembered which wine you preferred and always signaled before changing lanes. We have 2 sons. Owen, who is 8 and obsessed with anything mechanical, and Ben, who is 6 and still comes into our bed during thunderstorms. We live in a Victorian on Prospect Street that Derek and I had spent 3 years restoring together, room by room, the way you restore things when you believe the foundation is sound. I had believed the foundation was sound for 11 years. Simone tried to recover. She said, "I just mean he worried about the wedding planning stress on you with the boys." But her voice had already lost its footing and we both knew it. I put my wineglass down on the table with a care that felt like the last controlled thing I would do for a very long time. "How long have you known?" I asked. The party continued around us, Jess laughing at something at the far end of the table, someone's phone playing a song too loud, the ordinary noise of women celebrating an ordinary happiness. And Simone sat across from me in the middle of all of it and couldn't answer, which was of course its own answer. I excused myself. I walked to the restroom. I stood in front of the mirror under the buzzing fluorescent light, and I looked at my own face for a long moment, the face of a woman who had just understood that 2 of the people she trusted most had been keeping something from her, together, for long enough that it had become ordinary to them. I did not cry. Not yet. I thought, I am going to need to be very careful now. Millhaven is the kind of town where your history is always visible. You buy groceries next to the parents of students you teach. You see your neighbors at the post office and the hardware store and the elementary school pickup line, and everyone's life exists in a kind of permanent mild legibility. It was one of the reasons I had loved it when Derek and I moved there 11 years ago from Boston, newly married and deliberately choosing the smaller, quieter version of everything. Derek had been the one to find Millhaven. He had a commission with a local firm and an idea about work-life balance that he articulated convincingly and that I had found, at 27, genuinely persuasive. I had grown up in a loud, overlapping family in Providence, for siblings, a house that was always full, and the promise of something quieter appealed to me in ways I hadn't entirely examined. I found a teaching position at Millhaven Regional. We bought the Victorian on Prospect Street. We had Owen, then Ben. We built the particular architecture of a life that looks from the outside like the right choices made in the right order. Derek was a good husband in the ways that are easiest to verify and hardest to argue with. He came home for dinner. He coached Owen's soccer team. He fixed things when they broke. He was present in the physical sense so consistently that his emotional distance, which had increased gradually over the last 3 years, like a tide going out, registered as busyness, as professional stress, as the natural dimming that everyone warned you about in long marriages. I had told myself that dimming was normal. I had been wrong. The first sign I missed came from Derek's phone, about 2.5 years before the Bachelorette party. He had left it on the kitchen counter while he showered, which was not unusual, and it had buzzed with a notification from an app one didn't recognize. Not a standard messaging app, something with a plain gray icon I'd never seen before. I noticed it the way you notice something peripheral and then decide not to look directly at it, because looking directly would require you to have a feeling about what you find. I didn't look. I was making lunches. Owen was asking me about something. I let it go. Looking back now with the full, ungenerous clarity of hindsight, that moment was the first time I made the choice that I would make over and over for the next 2 years. The choice to interpret ambiguity as innocence, because the alternative required a kind of courage I wasn't ready to spend. The second sign was Simone. She had entered our lives the way good friendships do in your 30s, gradually and then completely. We had met at a school event. Her daughter was in Owen's class. She was warm, funny, deeply practical, the kind of friend who showed up with dinner when you were sick and didn't require the social maintenance that some friendships demand. Derek liked her. They had an easy, bantering rapport at dinner parties that I had always found evidence of how well my two worlds, marriage and friendship, fit together. I had been reading it as integration. It was something else entirely. About 18 months before the Bachelorette party, Simone began canceling our Thursday coffees with a frequency that broke from her established pattern. The reasons were always legitimate: her daughter's schedule, a work project, a minor illness. Individual instances completely believable. The pattern was what I didn't allow myself to examine, because examining a pattern in a friendship requires you to consider that the friendship may be doing something other than what you think it's doing. I noticed she became slightly more careful around me. The ease she normally had, the way she would say anything, interrupt her own sentences, start stories in the middle, developed a small, almost invisible seam of deliberateness, as if she was, on some level, monitoring herself. Called it stress. I called it her own private difficulties, which I was respecting by not prying. Derek, in this same period, began suggesting we spend more evenings at home rather than with friends. Nothing dramatic. A preference for quiet weeknights. A mild resistance to the dinner parties we used to host. I thought he was tired. He was working on a large commission in Burlington, a mixed-use development that consumed him through most of that year and gave his distraction a perfectly credible address. Even now, I understand that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay. I was not ready to pay it. I had 2 sons, a Victorian on Prospect Street, 11 years of a life I had built and believed in, and I was not going to dismantle all of that on the evidence of a gray app icon and a friend who'd become slightly careful. So I didn't. And the thing I was not looking at continued to exist, patient and untouched, waiting for a wine bar in Burlington and a woman who had been holding something too long. I drove home from Burlington alone at 11:15, having told Jess I had a headache, having hugged her with the full warmth I genuinely felt for her because none of what was happening was her fault, having avoided Simone's eyes as I collected my coat. Simone texted me 4 times before I reached the highway. I didn't read the messages. Derek was awake when I got home. He was in the kitchen, a glass of water on the counter, reading something on his laptop. He looked up when I came in, and his face arranged itself into the familiar expression of mild, comfortable attention, the face of a man who expects a normal evening to continue normally. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Good. Jess had a great time." I went upstairs. I checked on Owen and Ben. Owen on his back with one arm flung over his face, Ben curled with his stuffed rabbit, and I stood in the hallway between their rooms for a long moment in the dark, listening to my own house. Then I went into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the words Simone had said, and the look on her face after she said them, and the 11 years of my life that might be sitting on a completely different foundation than the one I'd believed in. I didn't sleep. I lay beside Derek and felt the architecture of the room change around me. The same furniture, the same light through the same curtains, the same sound of his breathing, all of it identical to every other night and somehow entirely different, the way a word looks strange if you stare at it long enough. I began the next morning to pay a different kind of attention. I am an English teacher. My professional life is built on close reading, on the understanding that what a text means and what it appears to mean are sometimes different things, and that the gap between them is where the truth lives. I had been a careless reader of my own life for too long. I stopped being careless. Derek used our joint laptop for work sometimes, and I had his passwords for practical reasons, shared accounts, the boys' school portal, and had simply never used them for anything else, because the thought had never seriously presented itself before. It presented itself now. I went through his email on a Thursday evening while he was at soccer practice with Owen. I was methodical and I was fast. I found nothing in the main account, which told me something in itself, because Derek was not a disorganized person and a completely clean email history has its own kind of implausibility. The secondary account I found by checking the browser's saved passwords. A Gmail I didn't recognize. His name followed by a string of numbers. The password filled in automatically. The emails were carefully managed. Most had been deleted. But the trash folder had not been emptied in 11 days, and in the trash folder were 7 emails from an address I didn't recognize, a name, a woman's name, K. Hartwell, that were brief and warm and referenced things, a restaurant in Burlington, a weekend in October, something called the Stowe situation, which was referred to obliquely but clearly enough that I understood what it meant. My hands were cold. The kitchen was warm. Ben was in the next room watching something on the television. I could hear the cartoon sounds, bright and repetitive. And I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open and I read 7 emails that described the last 8 months of my husband's life as it actually existed, rather than as it had been presented to me. I took photographs of the screen. I closed the laptop and put it back exactly where I'd found it. I thought, I told Derek this would come out eventually. Simone had said that. Past tense. Told. Not told him after it started. The syntax was the syntax of someone who had been part of an ongoing conversation, had weighed in repeatedly, had established a position in relation to a situation she'd known about long enough to have an opinion about it more than once. How long had she known? I understood then that I was dealing with 2 betrayals, not one. And that the second one, in some ways, was going to be harder to survive because Derek I had loved as a husband loves with the particular blind spots love constructs. But Simone I had trusted as a friend trusts, which is a different and more naked kind of trust, the kind that doesn't come with the romantic architecture that can, at least, explain its own failures. She had been in my kitchen. She had held Ben when he was sick. She had listened to me talk about my marriage, my doubts, my hopes, and she had known the whole time or for long enough what was actually happening. The specific weight of that settled into me slowly, across several days, like water finding the lowest point in a room. I did not tell Derek what I knew. I did not tell Simone that I had read the emails. I went to school on Monday and taught The Great Gatsby to a room of 17-year-olds. The green light, the dream, the fundamental American capacity for self-deception. And I thought about how close reading is always an act of delayed understanding. I called a family law attorney in Burlington named Patricia Osei, whose name I found through the Vermont Bar Association. I made the appointment in my classroom during my free period. Quietly, the door closed. I brought the photographs of the emails to the consultation. Patricia was direct and thorough. She explained what I would and wouldn't be able to use, what documentation mattered, what the process looked like in Vermont. She asked me whether there were assets I should be aware of. I told her about the Victorian on Prospect Street, our joint accounts, Derek's firm partnership which had vested the previous year. She asked if I had financial records access. I did. I had always done our taxes. I had always been the one to manage the household accounts. Derek handled his business finances separately, as most architects with firm partnerships did. But the personal accounts were mine to manage and always had been. A division of labor that had seemed sensible and that I now understood, with the particular bitterness of irony, had been entirely in my favor without my having engineered it. I went through 3 years of bank statements over the following week. I found what I expected to find. Withdrawals and charges that mapped, imperfectly but legibly, onto a second life. A hotel in Stowe in October, the Stowe situation, charged to a credit card I hadn't examined closely because Derek managed his own professional card and I had trusted that division. Restaurants in Burlington on evenings when he had told me he was working late. A piece of jewelry, $340, a Burlington boutique, on a date that was not my birthday, not our anniversary, not any occasion that belonged to me. I did not feel righteous about any of this. I felt tired and precise and increasingly clear. The woman, Kay Hartwell, was named Kristen. She worked at the development firm that had commissioned Derek's Burlington project. She was 32, unmarried, and I found her on professional networks without difficulty. I did not contact her. She was not, as far as I could determine, the primary author of what had happened. She was a person Derek had chosen, which made her part of the story but not its center. The center was Derek. And separately, Simone. I contacted Simone on a Wednesday, 9 days after the Bachelorette party. I asked her to meet me for coffee. She agreed with a relief that was audible even through a text message. Too many exclamation points, too much warmth, the overcompensation of someone who has been dreading a conversation and is grateful it's finally happening. We sat in the coffee shop on Mill Street. I ordered my usual. I let her talk for 4 minutes. She had prepared, I could tell, a version of things in which she had been a reluctant and troubled guardian of an impossible secret, in which her primary emotion had been worry for me, in which she had urged Derek repeatedly to come clean. The account was not entirely untrue, but it was carefully shaped, and what it shaped away from was the part where she had chosen, month after month, to continue having coffee with me and continue knowing. How long? I asked when she finished. She looked at her cup. 14 months. 14 months. Owen had broken his arm 14 months ago, and Simone had driven him to urgent care with me because Derek was unavailable, working late, I had thought, in Burlington on the commission. I understood denial isn't weakness. I understood it viscerally, sitting across from Simone, because what I saw in her face was not a villain but a person who had made a choice she couldn't undo and had been living with it in the particular misery of someone who knows they've done wrong and has committed too far to correct it. She had told herself, I suspected, that protecting Derek, or protecting me from knowing, was a form of kindness. That is what we tell ourselves when we make cowardly choices. We call them kind. I need you to not contact me for a while, I said. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. I left money for both coffees because I didn't want to owe her even a coffee, and I left. I told Derek on a Saturday evening in January, after Owen and Ben were asleep. I had chosen the timing deliberately, not cruelly. I had thought carefully about how to do this in a way that didn't turn our kitchen into a battlefield the boys might walk into. I had chosen a Saturday because Sunday was a day I could manage with them alone if necessary, and because I had already arranged in advance that my sister Jess would take them for the afternoon the next day without requiring an explanation. I had the photographs of the emails printed and placed in a folder on the kitchen table. I had the bank statements marked. I had Patricia Osei's card in my pocket. Derek came into the kitchen expecting the ordinary end of an ordinary Saturday. He saw the folder. He saw my face. And in the space between those two things I watched him calculate, the way he calculated when he was presented with a structural problem, that particular quality of inward focus, and decide in the space of a few seconds how to proceed. He sat down. He did not deny it. I'll give him that, though I've turned it over enough times to know that choosing not to lie in the moment of exposure is not the same as having been honest throughout. He said her name before I did. He said it had started 11 months ago, not 14, not the number Simone had given me, and the discrepancy was small enough to argue about and large enough to mean something about which of them I trusted more. I put the printed emails on the table. 14 months, I said. Simone told me. Something moved across his face at Simone's name. Not surprise, but the specific expression of a person learning that a system they relied on has failed. And I saw in that expression the last piece of the architecture that he had known Simone knew, had counted on her loyalty as a buffer, had perhaps even constructed his timeline partly around what he believed Simone would or wouldn't say. He had misjudged her capacity for a second glass of wine at a bachelorette party. He talked for a long time. He said things that were probably true, that he had felt for several years, that we had grown into different versions of ourselves than the people who had moved to Millhaven, that he had not known how to say that he had made choices that he knew were wrong and had made them anyway. He did not say he didn't love me. He said something more honest and more devastating. That he had loved the life we had built more than he had known how to be honest inside of it. I let him finish. I said, I have an attorney. I'm going to ask you to stay somewhere else for a while. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I recognized, the one from our early years, when he was genuinely trying to read me, before he had decided that reading me wasn't necessary because I would accommodate whatever the room required. There was something real in it. Something that deserved at one point a different ending. I'm sorry, Nora, he said. And I believed him. That was the thing I hadn't expected, that I would sit across from him in our kitchen, with the evidence on the table between us, and believe the apology completely and find it, at the same time, entirely insufficient. I know, I said. He left that night. He stayed with a colleague. The house was very quiet, and I sat at the kitchen table for a while after he drove away, listening to the particular silence of a building in winter. The pipes, the old wood, the small adjustments a Victorian makes when the temperature drops outside. Then there was the twist I hadn't seen coming. 3 days after Derek left, I received an email from Kristen Hartwell. I almost didn't open it, but I had been practicing for weeks the discipline of looking at things directly, and I opened it. It was not what I expected. There was no apology, no plea, no drama. It was one paragraph, factual in tone, and what it told me was this. She had ended things with Derek in November, 2 months before the bachelorette party, 2 months before Simone's slip, because Derek had told her in October in Stowe that he intended to ask his wife for a divorce, that he had been planning to leave, that he wanted to be with her. He had not asked me for a divorce in November, or December, or January. He had told his girlfriend he was leaving me and then not left. He had continued living in our house, coaching Owen's soccer, putting Ben to bed, telling me nothing. Not because he had chosen to stay, but because he hadn't been able to bring himself to act on either choice, and in that paralysis had simply continued, hoping, I think, that something external would resolve what his own courage wouldn't. Simone's slip had been that external thing. She had given him, unwittingly, the ending he couldn't author himself. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about what it meant, not for the divorce proceedings which were already in motion, but for my understanding of what I had actually been living inside for the last several years. Not a marriage being deliberately destroyed. A man who had broken something and didn't know how to tell me, and had chosen the most damaging possible silence instead. That didn't forgive it, but it changed its shape. I wrote back to Kristen Hartwell. I thanked her for telling me. I meant it. The divorce took 10 months. It was not acrimonious, or rather, it had the particular controlled non-acrimony of two people with young children who understand that the war they want to have is a war their sons would lose. Patricia O'Say was excellent. We reached an agreement on the Victorian that allowed me to stay in it, buying Derek's share at appraised value over time. We agreed on a custody arrangement that prioritized the boys' school year, and gave Derek substantial time. He was a good father. That had not been a lie. Millhaven being Millhaven, the separation became known. Not dramatically, no one confronted me in the grocery store or said anything overt, but the town's awareness of my circumstances was palpable in the particular way small-town awareness always is, in slightly longer conversations, in the careful absence of certain topics, in the specific warmth people extend to someone they've decided needs it. I taught my classes. I coached the school's literary magazine. I made Owen's lunches and helped Ben through a phase of nightmares that lasted 2 months and that the child psychologist said was entirely normal, and that I sat through every night at the edge of his bed with the specific patience of a person who has learned that the only way through certain things is to stay present and wait. Jess's wedding was in June. I was her maid of honor, a role that had been Simone's until January, when Jess, who had not been told everything but had been told enough, quietly and lovingly reassigned it. I walked down the aisle in a blue dress I had bought in Burlington on a Saturday afternoon with Owen and Ben in tow, both of them in miniature ties, arguing about whose side of the aisle was better. Simone was at the wedding. We are in the same town and we have children in the same school, and that will be true for years. We did not speak at the wedding, but we were in the same room, which is a different kind of reconciliation than forgiveness, a recognition that some things can coexist without resolution. Derek came to pick up the boys one Sunday in August, for months after he had moved out, and asked if we could talk. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same chairs, and he said that he had been in therapy, which I hadn't known, and that he understood now why he had done what he had done in a way he hadn't understood before. He said, "I think I was afraid of being ordinary. I think Millhaven felt like a ceiling and I didn't know how to tell you that. And I made every possible wrong choice instead of one hard, honest conversation." I thought about that for a long time after he left. I thought about how much damage a person can do with the simple refusal to have a conversation they're afraid of. Not malice. Not cruelty in its deliberate form. Just the sustained preference for avoidance over honesty, repeated often enough to hollow out the structure of a shared life. I recognized it a little. I had done my own version of it. The gray app icon on the counter, the pattern in Simone's cancellations, the quality of Derek's voice on late-night phone calls. I had practiced my own avoidance, told myself my own comfortable stories, chosen hope over clarity for years. We had, in that specific way, been well matched. By autumn, something had shifted. Not dramatically, I didn't wake up one morning transformed, but the Victorian on Prospect Street, which had felt haunted for the first several months, began to feel like mine again in a way it hadn't been even before everything happened. I repainted the study in a color I had always wanted and Derek had always considered too dark. I started a book club. I went to Providence for Thanksgiving and sat in my mother's loud, overlapping full house and felt the specific relief of a person returning to a place where they are known completely and loved without condition. Owen asked me once, doing homework at the kitchen table, whether I was sad about Dad living somewhere else. "Sometimes," I said. "Are you okay?" he asked. He was 8. And the question had the directness of 8, no cushioning around it. Yes, I said. And it was true in the way that important true things are true. Not simply, not without complication, but genuinely. He went back to his homework. I went back to grading papers. The next morning I drove to school through the first real snow of the season, Millhaven quiet and white and exactly itself, and I thought about what it means to read something carefully. A text, a room, a life, and how the meaning you find always depends on when you're willing to look. I was willing now. That was different. That was enough. What this story does not ask you to feel is simple outrage. Derek cheated. Simone kept a secret she had no right to keep. Those are facts and they caused real damage. But if you hold the story at arm's length and look at its full shape, what you find is something more uncomfortable than a clean moral verdict. A pattern in which two people, Nora and Derek, spent years in a marriage that had developed a slow structural dishonesty long before the affair began. Derek's betrayal was spectacular in the way betrayals tend to be when they finally surface. But his confession, "I was afraid of being ordinary, I thought Millhaven was a ceiling," is not a justification. It is a diagnosis, offered too late, of what had been true for years without being said. He had wanted a different life and had not told his wife. He had told his girlfriend instead. And then, when given the chance to act on that want, when Kristen had ended things on the understanding that he was leaving, he had done nothing. He had simply continued, frozen between two choices, waiting for something to decide for him. That paralysis is perhaps the most psychologically honest detail in the entire story. It is the portrait of a man whose core fear, mediocrity, smallness, the sense of a life that has shrunk to fit around him, had metastasized into an incapacity for action. He couldn't leave the marriage. He couldn't recommit to it. He couldn't end the affair cleanly. He had mistaken motion for decision and found himself, in the end, having moved everywhere and chosen nothing. Nora's version of the same failure was quieter and more sympathetic, but it was there. The gray app icon set down without examination, the pattern in Simone's behavior explained away, the quality of Derek's voice on late-night calls noted and then consciously filed under stress. She had been, by her own eventual recognition, a careless reader of her own life. She knew how to read a text with precision. She had simply extended to her marriage the charitable interpretive framework she withheld from literature, the one that says assume benign intent, give the benefit of the doubt, resist the reading that costs the most. Simone is the character who doesn't resolve cleanly. She had been placed in an impossible position, true, but of her own choosing. The moment she learned what Derek was doing, she had options. Tell Nora immediately, remove herself from the situation, refuse to participate in the silence. She chose none of these. She chose to stay close to Nora, which she probably experienced as loyalty, while maintaining the secret that made the closeness a form of deception. That is the specific moral incoherence of what she did. Not malice, but the coward's hope that proximity could substitute for honesty. What the Kristen Hartwell email adds to the story is the dimension that reframes everything. The affair was already over. Derek had already, in his way, chosen. He had told his girlfriend he was leaving his wife, then couldn't act on it. And so by the time Simone's words landed in Burlington, by the time Nora began her methodical documentation, the thing she was uncovering was not an ongoing wound but a situation that had already, privately, begun to collapse under its own weight. That doesn't change the damage, but it changes the understanding. Nora was not, in the end, racing to stop something in progress. She was finally reading accurately something that had already happened, the dissolution of a marriage that neither she nor Derek had been honest enough to name while it was occurring. The question that stays after the story ends is not whether Nora did the right thing. She did. The question is what kind of attention we owe the people we love, and whether love is served by the charitable interpretations we extend to the things we're afraid to understand. What I keep returning to is the moment Nora stands in the hallway between her son's rooms in the dark, listening to her own house. Nothing has changed yet. The furniture is the same. Derek is downstairs. The boys are breathing quietly in their beds. And she is standing there holding knowledge that is about to change everything, not yet having decided what to do with it. That moment, before the documentation, before the attorney, before any of it, is the one that tells you who she is. She doesn't collapse. She doesn't confront. She listens. She thinks. There's a version of this story where she never opened the laptop, where she decided again not to look directly, where the gray app icon and Simone's careful avoidance and Derek's late-night calls all remained in the category of things she had chosen not to examine. Most of us have those categories. The real question this story leaves isn't about what Derek did or what Simone chose or even what Nora uncovered. It's simpler and more personal than that. What are we not looking at right now because looking would cost us the story we're living inside? That's not comfortable. But honest things rarely are.